Hello, my name is Amy and today I am going to be talking to you about two red wine grapes. Both are of French origin and both were in fact mentioned and kind of put more on the international stage due to a film that came out in the 1990s, which absolutely scandalized one of them and actually caused a global decline in the sales of this wine, and revered the other, which caused much more of an international interest. I am, of course, talking about Sideways, and the grapes are Merlot and Pinot Noir. Let's start with Merlot. It's estimated that Merlot is around 300 years old and originated from the southwest of France, the Bordeaux region, where it actually plays a very important part of what we call the Bordeau Blend. Anyone with a vested interest in Bordeaux particularly will have heard of growths and chateaux and know that the right-hand side of the riverbank is where the Merlot heavy wines are found. Superstar wines such as Petrus can set you back about $5,000. They're that good. The name Merlot is meant to mean little blackbird in an old ancient French dialect. It is the most planted grape within the Bordeaux region, unsurprisingly, and the second most planted grape in the world after Cabernet Sauvignon, accounting for about 600,000 acres worldwide. So where else is it grown? Other areas in France where it's particularly popular are places like Bergerac and Cahors, where it's blended a lot with Malbec. In Italy, northeastern Italy and Tuscany, Merlot is usually blended with Sangiovese or Cabernet Sauvignon, or both of these grapes. It tends to prefer sort of wet, damp clay soils, so can be found growing a lot in places like Romania, Moldova and Eastern European countries as well. But it's also grown quite a lot in the States, particularly Washington State is producing some excellent examples. You can find it in California, which of course I will come on to in a moment. China, it's gaining huge amounts of popularity. Chile has had a huge impact with its Merlot growth on markets like the UK. In New Zealand and Australia, although it can tend to be sometimes too warm, particularly in Australia, it's actually being used as a blending partner to grapes like Cabernet Sauvignon. And South Africa is said to be producing some excellent examples, particularly of barrel-aged Merlot. So what does it taste like and why has it caused so much fuss internationally? Well, just like any grape, it will taste slightly different everywhere it's grown, but generally it produces a style of jammy wines, think fruits of the forest, soft, perfumed, and that's also why it's such a popular blending grape. For that reason as well, we can talk about Merlot as having two primary styles. Either the Bordeaux style, which tends to be more crunchy, black fruit, more astringent tannins, or the international style of production, which is more fruit-driven, heavy texture, velvety, soft, and was actually championed by California. In order to be able to produce this much softer international version, producers leave the grapes on the vine for as long as possible to encourage maximum colour and sugar and fruitiness from the vines. And California kind of took this to the next level. They were really clever with their wine marketing in some ways, and they positioned themselves as creating Bordeaux without the chewiness of Cabernet Sauvignon. What tends to separate Californian Merlot from the rest of European Merlot, as I mentioned, is its texture. It's far more dense, far more rich, kind of velvety, sometimes cloying. The warmer climate is of course a massive aid in being able to produce these much bolder fruit-forward flavours. In Chile, what they've managed to achieve is produce this kind of soft Californian appeal, but without the density, that sort of overwhelming fruitness that can come from California wine. And in fact, particularly if you go to the UK and the on-trade, Chilean Merlot is known as some of the best value wines around, and you'll find it listed in probably every single pub and restaurant that there is. In the glass, it tends to be quite a deep ruby colour, similar to colour in Cabernet as what you'd find in a Cabernet Sauvignon, for example. But one really interesting tell of a Merlot, a young Merlot, is it will often have a red rim. So what does it taste like from all these regions we've mentioned? Well, generally it's an early ripening wine in the Old World, so in places like southwest France, and there you can expect raspberries and strawberries and medium acidity. Producers tend to pick it slightly earlier to make sure it's got enough acidity in it. And when it's aged, it kind of sometimes has aromas of incense or cedar, or even truffle as well, and new leather. Which style is best? Well, again, that is totally up to your own palate and what you like. Arguably, Bordeaux has some of the finest wines in the world. The Merlot is often blended there, but if you prefer a more lean Merlot with black cherry and kind of new leather elements, then try Old World. If you prefer your Merlot to be more fruit forward and chocolatey and velvety and really a mouthful of sort of sweet, soft tannins, then definitely go New World, Washington State, Columbia Valley. Chilean Merlot airs more on the Old World style, but you can certainly in the newer regions within Chile find some more fruit forward, more full, luscious examples of the grape as well. In Australia, it's kind of grown everywhere, but particularly areas like the Hunter Valley and Margaret River, where you find other classic noble grapes such as Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay that seem to thrive there. They also produce Merlot in a more of a lush style that takes on licorice and cassis as it ages as well. I think it's safe to say the reputation of Merlot has recovered since those infamous lines from that 1990s Sideways film. But the other grape that was certainly mentioned a lot and took on a whole new level of interest within that film is of course Pinot Noir, and interest has just carried on growing for this grape. As Merlot is regarded as quite an easy grape to grow, and that's why you can find it pretty much all over the world, Pinot Noir is the polar opposite. It's regarded as sensitive and fussy, and a slight change in climate or temperature or weather conditions can totally throw off the vintage for the year, because it is so terroir driven. So when I mention that, I mean it's so specific. You're really tasting the land because it changes so much depending on where it's grown. And this expression of place that it's so well known for means that it hasn't got a huge amount of plantings in the world. There's about 290,000 acres of it planted worldwide. 75,000 of those or so are in France, in the Burgundy region more predominantly, and 73,000 can be found in the States. If you ever see a cluster of Pinot Noir grapes as well, they're very, very small and they grow in very tight bunches, which means it's incredibly susceptible to disease, which can then spread from berry to berry. It also means it's difficult for it to ripen evenly. It's not particularly suited to warm regions where there would be uneven ripeness, and it would probably lose acidity before it had gained any real personality. It also means the regions where it grows really well are cooler regions, which tend to have autumn rains, which can also penetrate the berries and just cause a total lack of character. The grape has its origins in eastern France, and along with a grape called Blanc, is actually parent to a number of other very well-known grapes, such as Pinot Blanc, Pinot Meunier, Pinot Grigio, to name just a few. Now, I mentioned that it's terroir driven, that it's a huge expression of place, and this is really important, and actually why for French producers in particular to name the vineyard. There are so many different clones of Pinot Noir that if you get the wrong clone in the wrong vineyard, the wine will be super disappointing. And it's also why some of the best vineyards can command such high prices. It is grown in relatively large quantities in northeast France, Champagne, of course, it is blended with Chardonnay and Pinot Meunier. Moving to the eastern border of France, in Germany, it's hugely popular. It's known as Spätburgunder there, and in fact plantings there have grown to almost as much as Riesling. It's now the second most planted grape in Germany after Riesling. Some people would argue that Pinot Noir loses a sense of self, a sense of character outside of Burgundy, but in fact I think it expresses itself so well in the right terroir, in the right areas, that it just produces a totally different style of grape that doesn't mean it's any less expensive sometimes, but particularly areas like Oregon are now producing incredible Pinot Noirs, New Zealand as well. The style is different. In Burgundy, you can expect soft tannins, perfumed, pale in the glass, sort of strawberries and raspberries, and when it's aged it gains some leather, sometimes farmyard, although that's not always a good thing, depends who you're talking to. Whereas in the New World, in places like New Zealand, produces much rounder, deeper, sort of velvety wines, but still with this really curious, bright acidity to them as well. In New Zealand, particularly areas like Martinborough and Marlborough, the Pinot Noir version is far more full-bodied. In fact, it's sliding more towards a Merlot in terms of its texture, whereas in Oregon, Oregon is regarded almost as a bridge between Burgundy and this more fruit-forward style found in New Zealand, and it produces very elegant examples of this grape. The other reason that consumers love Pinot Noir is due to its versatility with food. Because it tends to have a lot more acidity than other grapes, it makes it a fabulous food wine. And you can pair it with anything from game, pheasant, lamb to Burgundian versions, can even be paired with things like salmon. Pinot Noir was famously always the wine that you could pair with a white meat. We're quite stuck sometimes on pairing red wine with red meat, but actually Pinot Noir is light enough, perfumed enough, soft enough to be paired with a white meat or a game meat, and just be absolutely fabulous because of its levels of acidity. So which style suits you best? Well, again, it's a personal preference. If you're going old world, so if you're going France or Central Europe, you can certainly expect more ripe red fruits, berry fruits, strawberries, raspberries, cherries, more bright acidity, lighter in the palate when it's aged. And Pinot Noir doesn't age for decades and decades like other wines like Cabernet. But when it is aged, it tends to get more meaty qualities to it, mushroom, sort of earthy textures, and leather as well. Whereas the New World, it's more tropical fruits. The fruits are darker. Think more plums and black cherries and damsons. And when it ages, it errs more on the side of chocolate and cocoa and has a far more sort of softer texture to it as well. My personal favourite of the two grapes is probably Pinot Noir, just for its versatility and its sort of unpredictability as well. If it doesn't want to grow well, it won't, much to the wrath of wine producers. But as a starter, you're probably going to get a lot more value for money trying different varietals of Merlot. Pinot Noir, you might have to invest slightly more to find something that's really characteristic. And remember, with Pinot Noir, it's far more terroir driven, so you're really tasting much more of the place. And so sometimes it is actually worth investing just a little bit more money to really understand what those areas taste like. I hope this has been useful, and I look forward to tasting with you again sometime soon.